My name is Willa Marsh. I'm 37 years old, and at Sunday dinner this past spring, my mother set down her fork, looked at me across a table full of relatives, and laughed. "How does it feel to be useless, daughter?" She said it lightly, the way she says most cruel things, like it was a joke everyone was supposed to be in on. I'd quit my VP marketing job 14 months earlier to care for my grandmother through the last stretch of pancreatic cancer, unpaid full-time, while my brother Chase kept building his real estate business and showing up for exactly the holidays that photographed well. I looked at my mother, calm, and said, "Ask me again in a month, Mom." She laughed harder, assuming I was deflecting. I wasn't. I just hadn't told anyone yet what I'd actually spent those 14 months finding. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the person everyone's decided to underestimate is usually the one holding the paperwork. If you've ever been called useless by someone who never once asked what you were actually doing, this one's for you. Subscribe and drop a comment before we start, because what I found in my grandmother's accounts during those 14 months turned out to be worth a lot more than my mother's approval ever was. The dinner itself deserves a little more description, because the cruelty of it wasn't really the line itself, it was the audience she chose for it. My Aunt Denise was there, my cousin Priya and her husband, my mother's oldest friend Carol, who's attended enough family dinners over the years to functionally count as a relative. My mother waited until dessert had been served, until everyone had a fork in hand and nowhere polite to look away to, before she brought it up, asking me, in front of all of them, whether I had any job interviews lined up yet, whether I'd thought about what I actually wanted to do with my life, now that Grandma didn't need me anymore. I told her I was still figuring things out. That's when she laughed, and said the line that's been sitting in my chest ever since. A few people at the table laughed along with her, the nervous kind of laugh people do when they're not sure whether something is actually a joke. Priya didn't laugh. She caught my eye across the table, something like an apology in her expression, and I held on to that small kindness longer than I probably needed to. I should explain what those 14 months actually looked like, because my mother's version of them, the one she told at every family gathering, made it sound like I'd simply taken an extended vacation from having a real life. My grandmother, Ruth, raised me for long stretches during my own chaotic childhood, and when her diagnosis came, I didn't think twice about stepping away from my career to be there, managing medications, driving her to appointments 3 counties over, sitting with her through nights when the pain made sleep impossible for either of us. Chase visited on holidays, brought flowers, posted photos. My mother called it beautiful that he made time despite being so busy. There's a particular exhaustion to that kind of caregiving that's hard to explain to someone who's never done it. The way a day can be entirely consumed by small invisible labor, pill organizers and insurance phone calls, and learning to read pain on someone's face before they'll admit to it themselves. None of it photographable, none of it the kind of thing that shows up at a dinner table as an accomplishment. I stopped expecting recognition for it somewhere around month 6. What I didn't expect was to be actively mocked for it, laughed at across a table of relatives who'd mostly gone along with my mother's version of events, because it was easier than questioning it. I want to describe one night in particular, because it's the one I thought about most sitting at that dinner table months later. It was around 2 in the morning, maybe 8 months into her illness, and my grandmother woke up disoriented from the pain medication, gripping my hand hard enough to leave marks, asking me over and over whether her own mother was coming to get her, some fragment of childhood memory surfacing through the fog. I sat with her until sunrise, answering the same question a dozen different gentle ways, and drove myself to the pharmacy at 7 to refill a prescription before starting the whole day over again. Nobody photographed that night. Nobody posted about it. It just happened, the way most of the real weight of caregiving happens, in rooms nobody else was in. The first contradiction arrived, 2 days after that dinner, in the form of a phone call from my grandmother's estate attorney, Mr. Yarborough, asking to schedule a private meeting given my role in the estate. I sat with that phrase, "given your role," turning it over, because as far as my mother had always led everyone to believe, I had no formal role in anything, just the unpaid caregiver who'd let her career lapse for reasons nobody quite understood. The first hidden detail came directly from Yarborough himself. At that meeting, when he informed me, matter-of-factly, that my grandmother had quietly amended her will 8 months earlier, naming me as independent co-executor alongside the estate's standard provisions, a change she'd apparently made without discussing it with anyone else in the family, including Chase, who had held power of attorney over her finances for the past 3 years and had always assumed, reasonably enough at the time, that he'd be handling the estate alone. I asked Yarborough why she'd never mentioned it to me directly, and he said, carefully, that she'd told him she wanted to see how I handled the caregiving first, without the weight of knowing she'd already decided to trust me with something bigger, that she didn't want me stepping into that role from a sense of obligation or performance, rather than who I actually was when nobody was grading me for it. Sitting in his office, I felt something complicated, gratitude tangled up with a strange kind of grief, that she'd trusted me enough to build this quietly around me, and hadn't lived long enough to tell me herself. The trust shift came from Yarborough himself, previously just a distant formal presence in my grandmother's life, someone I'd nodded to at a handful of appointments without ever really registering as significant. At that same meeting he mentioned, carefully, that there were some things about the property accounts I'd want to review closely before any family meeting happened, a sentence delivered with enough weight that I understood, immediately, this wasn't routine estate housekeeping. I drove home from that meeting with the radio off, replaying the sentence over and over, trying to guess at what he might mean without letting my imagination run somewhere unfair to Chase before I actually had proof of anything. I'd spent 14 months building a certain kind of peace with my brother, or at least a functional distance, telling myself his absence during our grandmother's illness was simply who he was, busy, avoidant of hard things, not malicious. I didn't want to be the sister who assumed the worst the moment a lawyer used a careful tone of voice. I told myself I'd wait for the actual paperwork before deciding what any of it meant. The personal betrayal arrived once I actually sat down with 3 years of bank records for my grandmother's small laundromat business, the modest chain of 4 locations she'd built decades earlier, and that Chase had technically managed under his power of attorney. Buried in the transaction history was a recurring management fee, paid to Chase personally, monthly, for services that, according to the on-site staff schedules, corresponded to barely any actual visits to the properties at all. I remember sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table, the same table where I'd once done homework as a kid, spreadsheets spread out where placemats used to go, doing the math 3 separate times because I didn't want to trust the first result. Chase's fee had started small, reasonable even, in the first few months of his power of attorney, and had crept steadily upward over 3 years, a pattern that looked less like compensation for work performed and more like someone slowly testing how much nobody would notice. The properties themselves told their own quiet story once I actually drove out to see them, something I hadn't done in months, caught up as I'd been in Nana's daily care during the same period Chase was supposedly managing them. 2 of the 4 laundromats had visible maintenance issues, a broken dryer at the Elmwood location that had apparently sat out of service for 4 months, a leak in the roof at the Cambridge Street building that Otis had mentioned to Chase, repeatedly according to the maintenance log. None of it had been urgent enough to threaten the business outright, but all of it painted the same picture, a property manager collecting a fee for oversight he wasn't actually providing. The first real consequence became concrete once I totaled the discrepancy, just over $60,000 diverted over 3 years, money that should have gone toward my grandmother's care costs, the professional in-home nursing she'd actually needed and gone without for most of her final year, the exact gap I filled myself unpaid, because nobody had told me there was supposed to be money for that. I sat with that number longer than I probably should have, doing the math on what $60,000 actually could have bought during those 14 months, a part-time nurse for the overnight shifts that wore me down the most, maybe even enough for me to keep a foot in my own career instead of stepping away entirely. I wasn't angry about the money for my own sake, not primarily. I was angry on my grandmother's behalf, for a final year that had been harder than it needed to be, because the resources meant to ease it had quietly gone somewhere else. The unexpected ally arrived through Otis Pruitt, the laundromat chain's longtime on-site manager, a quiet man who'd worked for my grandmother for over 20 years. When I called him with routine questions about the property schedules, he hesitated, then told me, carefully, that he'd flagged irregular deposit patterns to Chase directly over a year earlier and been brushed off, and that he'd kept his own informal notes since then, uneasy but unsure who else he could safely bring it to. Otis had known my grandmother since he was in his 20s, had watched her build that little chain of laundromats from a single storefront into something she was genuinely proud of, and I think part of what finally moved him to speak up wasn't loyalty to me specifically, but loyalty to her memory, a sense that letting this slide any further would have been its own kind of disrespect to a woman who'd trusted him with her business for 2 decades. He apologized more than once for not pushing harder the first time he'd noticed something wrong, and I told him he didn't owe me that apology, that most people don't have the standing to push back against a boss's son without real consequences to themselves. He told me something else that afternoon that stuck with me, that my grandmother used to stop by the Elmwood location unannounced every few months, back before she got sick, just to chat with customers and make sure the machines were running right, a habit Chase had never once continued after taking over. Otis said he'd assumed, for a while, that Chase was just busy in a different way than his grandmother had been, running things from a distance the way a modern property manager might. It wasn't until the deposits started looking strange that he realized distance and neglect weren't quite the same thing he'd been giving Chase credit for. The evidence that changed everything arrived when Otis forwarded those notes alongside property tax records that revealed something I hadn't yet found on my own: a $25,000 loan Chase had taken out against one of the rental properties using his power of attorney authority, never disclosed to my grandmother, never repaid, sitting quietly on the property's title for over a year. I called Yarborough the same evening I found that loan document, later than his office hours technically allowed, and he picked up anyway, something I've come to understand says more about how seriously he took my grandmother's estate than any billing rate could capture. He walked me through what a loan like that meant procedurally, that using power of attorney authority to encumber a principal's property for the attorney-in-fact's own benefit, without disclosure, sat about as far outside acceptable fiduciary conduct as anything he'd seen in years of estate work, careful phrasing that still landed like a verdict. I felt, compiling all of this into a clean summary for Yarborough, something close to relief. The sense that once this reached the estate's formal accounting process, the discrepancy would simply correct itself quietly, through paperwork, without needing to become a larger family reckoning than it already was. The second betrayal came from a text message thread Chase forwarded me, almost defensively, during our conversation in his car, one where our mother, months earlier, had written simply, "Just handle it quietly, don't worry Mom with the details," in response to Chase mentioning, vaguely, that he'd needed to borrow against one of the properties to cover a rough patch. She hadn't structured anything herself in that exchange. She'd simply chosen not to ask a single follow-up question, chosen comfort over curiosity, in a way that told me she at least suspected something wasn't right and decided her son's reputation mattered more than her own mother's financial protection. I want to describe what it actually felt like reading that text for the first time because I don't think anger fully captures it. It was more like watching a photograph develop in reverse, a picture I thought I understood slowly losing its familiar shape and becoming something else entirely. My whole life I'd understood my mother's favoritism toward Chase as something soft, misguided, but essentially harmless, the ordinary blindness parents sometimes have toward a child who reminds them of themselves. This wasn't entirely soft anymore either. This was a woman choosing not to look, deliberately, dressed up the entire time as simply being a supportive mother to her son. I didn't confront her immediately. I sat with that message for 2 full days, rereading it, trying to find an innocent explanation I could offer her the benefit of, and failing to locate one no matter how generously I tried to read her words. There's a particular kind of grief in realizing a parent's love for a sibling has curdled into something closer to willful blindness, and I spent those 2 days mourning a version of my mother I'm not sure ever fully existed outside of my own hopeful imagination. The stakes became formally legal once I filed, as co-executor, a formal accounting objection through probate, requiring Chase to produce full documentation for every transaction made under his power of attorney, opening a fiduciary review process that neither he nor my mother could simply talk their way around at a family dinner anymore. Yarborough walked me through what this process would actually look like before I filed, careful to manage my expectations the way I imagine any good estate attorney does for a client about to formally accuse their own sibling of financial misconduct. He explained that fiduciary accounting reviews move slowly by design, that Chase would have a formal opportunity to respond and explain each transaction, and that the goal of the process wasn't punishment for its own sake. It was simply making sure the numbers finally told the truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. I signed the paperwork 2 days later, my hand steadier than I expected it to feel. The hidden motive surfaced once Chase, confronted quietly before the formal review escalated further, admitted his real estate business had been struggling for nearly 2 years, a downturn and one bad investment eating into margins he'd never told anyone about, and that he'd used our grandmother's accounts as what he called a temporary bridge, genuinely believing in some rationalized corner of his mind that he'd repay it once things turned around. I sat with him in his car outside a coffee shop for almost an hour that day, watching my brother, who had always seemed so effortlessly successful, admit that most of it had been held together by increasingly desperate improvisation for 2 years, that he'd told our mother a version of his finances that matched the version everyone expected of him rather than the truth, because the alternative felt, to him, like a kind of failure. He genuinely didn't know how to survive in this family. I understood, listening to him, that his desperation was real. It didn't make the $60,000 any less real either. The difficult choice arrived once I understood the full shape of what Chase had done. I could pursue this as a formal fiduciary breach, with real legal and financial consequences attached, or I could handle it through private restitution, protecting whatever fragile version of family unity still existed, knowing my mother would likely paint me as the vindictive one, regardless of which path I chose. I called an old friend from business school, someone who'd gone into family law and who I trusted to give me an honest answer rather than a comforting one, and laid the whole situation out for her over the phone one night. She told me something that ended up guiding most of my decisions from that point forward, that the goal of a fiduciary accounting isn't to punish someone for being human and desperate, it's to make sure the actual owner of the money, in this case, an estate that now needed to be distributed fairly among grandchildren, our grandmother had loved equally, gets what was always supposed to be theirs. I also thought, a lot, during that period, about what my grandmother would have actually wanted, weighing her documented early instinct to watch quietly rather than confront against the fact that quiet watching hadn't ultimately been enough to stop the pattern from growing. I decided, eventually, that she'd trusted me with co-executor status specifically because she suspected quiet watching alone wouldn't be enough eventually, and that honoring her trust meant actually using the authority she'd given me, carefully, but without flinching from it. The hidden history came from an old letter I found among my grandmother's papers, revealing she'd noticed smaller irregularities years earlier, well before my caregiving even began, and had chosen, at the time, to quietly monitor rather than confront Chase directly, hoping he'd course correct on his own before it became something larger. Her amendment naming me co-executor hadn't been a sudden reaction to my 14 months of caregiving. It had been a safeguard she'd been building toward for years, waiting for the right moment to put someone she trusted in a position to finally act. The letter itself was addressed to no one in particular, more like a private journal entry than correspondence, dated almost 4 years before her diagnosis. In it she wrote about noticing small discrepancies in the laundromat deposits, deciding to watch quietly rather than confront Chase outright because she still believed, at that point, he simply needed time to grow into the responsibility she'd handed him too early. Reading it, I understood my grandmother differently than I had before, not naive, not easily fooled, just patient in a way that had cost her more than any of us realized until it was too late for her to see the resolution herself. The power shift came from the combination now sitting in Yarborough's file, Otis's testimony, the undisclosed loan, and my grandmother's own documented early concerns, more than enough standing to move the fiduciary accounting forward, regardless of whatever pressure my family applied to make it quietly disappear. The desperate countermove arrived from my mother directly, once she learned the accounting was moving forward regardless of her objections, calling Yarborough's office herself, to frame me as bitter and vindictive, a daughter who'd apparently spent years nursing resentment over being second best, and was now using our grandmother's death as an excuse to attack her brother. I found out about that call secondhand, through Yarborough's assistant, and I remember the specific sting of it, not surprise exactly, but a fresh, sharper version of the same old wound, my mother reaching instinctively for the narrative that made me the problem rather than sitting, even briefly, with what the actual documents showed. She called me directly that same evening, her voice tight with something that wasn't quite an apology, asking whether I understood what this would do to Chase's reputation, to his marriage, to his standing with his own kids, as though the $60,000 simply didn't factor into the math she was doing. The evidence that finally closed the last gap came from Yarborough's own file audit, uncovering an email my mother had sent Chase 18 months earlier, explicit instructions on how to structure the loan paperwork so it wouldn't raise questions with our grandmother's accountant, proof that this hadn't been passive knowledge she'd simply looked away from. She'd actively helped build it. I remember exactly where I was when Yarborough called to tell me about that email, standing in my kitchen with dinner half made, and I had to set the phone down on the counter for a moment before I could finish the conversation. Everything I'd been willing to extend my mother, the benefit of the doubt about a vague text message, the possibility that willful blindness was the worst of it, collapsed the instant Yarborough read me 2 specific lines from that email. Tell him to list it as a maintenance improvement so it doesn't flag with the accountant, and make sure he doesn't mention the exact amount to your grandmother if she asks. 2 sentences, unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably hers. The complete truth landed heavily once I understood the entire architecture, years of quiet financial mismanagement enabled and protected by my mother's favoritism, while my own unpaid sacrifice, the 14 months that had apparently made me useless in her eyes, had existed in part because money that should have covered professional care had been quietly diverted somewhere else entirely. Sitting with that full picture, I found myself thinking less about punishment and more about the strange, sad symmetry of it, that the same family dynamic which had let Chase's mismanagement continue unchecked for years, my mother's instinct to protect his image at any cost, was the exact same dynamic that had made my own contribution invisible enough to mock at a dinner table. Both of us had been shaped by the same blind spot in her, just from opposite directions, him protected past the point of accountability, me dismissed past the point of recognition. The final confrontation happened in Yarborough's office, all of us present, the loan documents, Otis's notes, the earlier text message, and now the email laid out plainly across the table. I didn't raise my voice. I watched Chase's The room stayed quiet for a long stretch after Yarborough finished reading the summary, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any shouting could have. Chase spoke first, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years, admitting, plainly, that he'd known this day would come eventually, and had simply hoped it would arrive after he'd already fixed it quietly on his own. My mother reached for his hand across the table, an old reflex, and I watched him for the first time in this entire process, gently pull his hand back, telling her, quietly, that he needed to answer for this himself, that he didn't want her covering for him anymore. She looked at me at one point, near the end, and asked, almost pleadingly, why I was doing this to the family, and I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I wasn't doing anything to the family. I was simply refusing to keep doing what she'd always asked of me, which was staying quiet about things that were actually happening, so everyone could keep believing a more comfortable version of events instead. The legal and financial consequences settled into a formal repayment plan through the probate accounting, the diverted funds restored to the estate, Chase's power of attorney-era transactions formally reviewed and corrected, no criminal referral pursued, since full restitution was agreed to, before it needed to escalate any further than the family could bear. Chase's repayment plan stretched across 4 years, structured against future income from his business rather than a lump sum he genuinely couldn't produce, and I want to be honest that agreeing to that timeline felt less like mercy and more like practical math, since a faster demand would have simply bankrupted a business that, debts aside, still supported his own 2 kids. Otis stayed on managing the properties, now reporting jointly to both of us as co-executors instead of to Chase alone, a small structural change that Yarborough said should have existed from the beginning. The emotional justice, when it arrived, didn't look like a triumphant reveal. It looked like sitting across from my mother weeks later and telling her, calmly, without raising my voice, that the 14 months she'd called useless had actually been the months I spent noticing what nobody else in this family was willing to look at directly, and that whatever she wanted to call that useless had never once been the accurate word for it. She didn't apologize in any complete way that day, and I've made a kind of peace with the fact that she may never fully manage one. What she did do, a few weeks later, was show up unannounced at my apartment with a box of my grandmother's old recipe cards, the ones she used to make from memory, and said quietly that she thought I should have them since I was the one who actually sat with her while she still remembered how to make them. It wasn't an apology shaped like the word sorry. It was the closest thing to one my mother has ever managed to offer me, and I've decided to let that be enough for now, without pretending it undoes everything that came before it. Chase and I talk more carefully now than we used to, less warmly perhaps, but more honestly, both of us aware of exactly what the other one knows. He's rebuilding, slowly, the business steadier than it was, the repayment plan a monthly reminder neither of us needs to discuss out loud anymore, since Yarborough's office handles the logistics directly. I don't know if we'll ever be close in the way siblings are supposed to be close. I know we're at least being truthful with each other now, which is more than either of us managed for the 3 years before all of this came apart. The final quiet revelation came months later, going through my grandmother's things, when I found a birthday card she'd written, but never had the chance to send, tucked into a drawer with my name on the envelope. Inside, in her careful handwriting, she'd called me the one who always noticed what mattered when no one else was looking. A sentence I've read more times than I can count, since the closest thing to the last word in an argument my mother started at a dinner table. She never expected me to actually win. I keep that card on my desk now, in the small home office I finally set up, once I went back to work part-time, consulting for a handful of clients on my own schedule, instead of returning to the corporate job I'd left behind. It felt important somehow to build something new, rather than simply resuming the old version of my life, as though the 14 months and everything that followed had earned me the right to decide differently what useful was actually going to mean for me going forward. My mother and I have dinner together sometimes still, smaller gatherings now, fewer relatives as an audience. She hasn't said the word useless to me again, not once, not even in the careless, joking way she used to say most things. I don't know if that's growth or simply caution, and I've decided I don't need to know which it is in order to keep showing up, carefully, the way I've learned to show up for most things now, paying attention, keeping my own records, trusting what I notice even when nobody else has caught up to seeing it yet. That's my story. One cruel joke at a family dinner, one quiet amendment to a will, and 14 months it took my mother to understand exactly what I'd been doing while she thought I was doing nothing at all. If this reminded you that the quiet ones are often paying closer attention than anyone gives them credit for, take that as your sign to trust what you've noticed, even when nobody else believes you yet. Share this with someone who's ever been underestimated by their own family. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.